Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the sixth and last session of our webinar series, Dismantling Anti-Blackness in Education. I am Tambra Jackson, the Interim Dean for the School of Education at IUPUI, and I'm delighted to have you all present with us this evening. I'm looking forward to the conversation we get to have this evening with our panelists about how Black Lives Matter at school. As part of our mission, the School of Education is committed to examining our collective role in improving the human condition. And we do this with an explicit focus on social justice, inclusive of anti-racist and anti-oppressive perspectives and actions. Tonight's event is an opportunity for all of us to learn more about how anti-Blackness to learn more about anti-Blackness in order to help inform our work and action for education equity. The specific focus on anti-Blackness for this series is intended to increase our understanding of what is at the root of why Black children lead many negative statistics in education and what we all can do to disrupt that narrative. As noted by Kiana Mariah Ross in her June 24th, 2020 op-ed in the New York Times, quote, "Racism fails to fully capture what Black people in this country are facing. The right term is anti-Blackness. To be clear, racism isn't a meaningless term, but it's a catch-all that can encapsulate anything from Black people being denied fair access to mortgage loans to Asian students being burdened with a model minority label. It's not specific. Many Americans, awakened by watching the footage of Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd by kneeling on his neck, are grappling with why we live in a world in which Black death loops in a tragic screenplay scored with the wails of childless mothers and the entitled indifference of our murderers. And an understanding of anti-Blackness is the only place to start. Anti-Blackness is one way some Black scholars have articulated what it means to be marked as Black in an anti-Black world. It's more than just racism against Black people. That oversimplifies and defames it. It's a theoretical framework that illuminates society's inability to recognize our humanity, the disdain, disregard, and disgust for our existence, end quote. During this evening, we will have an opportunity to hear from our phenomenal featured panelists and pose questions to move our thinking and actions forward about the Black Lives Matter at School movement. We encourage you to use the chat function to dialogue with each other. And if you have a specific question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function. And now I'd like to pass the mic to our moderator for this evening, Dr. Natasha Flowers.
Thank you, Dean Jackson, and thanks to Jason Gross and Laverne Johnson for their on the scene and behind the scenes expertise. We certainly couldn't do this without your support and assistance. In 1994, Kersania E. Wise Whitehead wrote Chant to the Ancestors, which can be found in Sister Fire, Black Womanist Fiction and Poetry, edited by Charlotte Watson Sherman. I use it when I want to conjure the best of us and the strength of us past to present. Be still, my ancestors, and rest, for in me your spirit shall be revived. Like many of you, I am here tonight for restoration, recalibration, and certainly revival. We are honored to have this group, this collective of 4 educator activist scholars with us this evening. They will educate us and elevate our thinking around tonight's topic, Black Lives Matter in Schools. Each speaker has prepared 10 minutes of remarks, and I will jump right into introducing our presenters. I will introduce everyone, share their bio with you tonight, and then we will get started. Our first speaker, we want to note this evening, Jessie Hagopian, He's unfortunately able to join us tonight, but he also prepared a pre-recorded message due to a conflict this evening, and we're so grateful for this. Jesse Hagopian is a high school ethnic studies teacher in Seattle, a national steering committee member of Black Lives Matter at School, an editor for Rethinking Schools magazine, and a campaign organizer for the Zen Education Project's Teach the Black Freedom Struggle. He is the co-editor of the books Black Lives Matter at School, An Uprising for Educational Justice, Teaching for Black Lives, Teacher Unions, and Social Justice, and the editor of More Than a Score, A New Uprising Against High Stakes Testing. Jesse is the recipient of the 2019 Social Justice Teacher of the Year Award from Seattle Public Schools Department of Racial Equity, the Seattle NAACP Youth Coalition's 2019 Racial Justice Teacher of the Year Award winner, and the 2013 National Secondary Teacher of the Year awarded by the Academy of Arts and Sciences. His commentary on education and race has been featured on many national programs, including HBO's Problem Areas with Wyatt Cenac, NBC's Education Nation, the PBS NewsHour, and Democracy Now! Christopher R. Rogers, pronouns he, him, his, was born and raised in Chester, Pennsylvania, and has fulfilled the role of Curriculum Committee Coordinator for National Black Lives Matter at School since 2018. He serves as Public Programs Director for the Paul Robeson House and Museum and sits on the board of the Philadelphia Student Union. Okaikor I.E. Price, Dr. Okaikor I.E. Price, is a former classroom teacher, teacher leader, and organizer who is committed to collectively undoing and unlearning the racist, colonial, patriarchal, and other oppressive systems and structures that hinder us all from being able to access our full human selves. She is a core trainer with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, co-founder of an organization, MAPSO Freedom School, and is a founding steering committee member for the National Black Lives Matter in School, a network of educators and organizers committed to centering Black students, educators, and communities while advocating for the creation of anti-racist learning environments for all students. And let me go back, as I didn't say her name in its fullness. Awo Okaikor I.E. Price. I want to make sure that I said that correctly. I still stumbled a little bit, so forgive me on that. But it's such a beautiful name, and I do not want to mess it up. Our next panelist is Dr. Denisha Jones. She is the director of the Art of Teaching program at Sarah Lawrence College. She is a former kindergarten teacher and preschool director who spent the past 17 years in teacher education. Denisha is an education justice advocate and activist. She serves as the co-director for Defending the Early Years Incorporated, the assistant executive director for the Badass Teachers Association, and an administrator for United Opt-Out National. Since 2017, she has served on the steering committee for the National Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action. In 2020, she joined the organizing committee for Unite to Save Our Schools. Her first co-edited book, Black Lives Matter at School, An Uprising for Educational Justice, was published in December 2020 by Haymarket Books. Thank you all so much for joining us. And at this time, we will now hear the pre-recorded presentation from Mr. Jesse Hagopian.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jesse Hagopian. I use he, him pronouns. I'm coming to you from occupied Duwamish and Coast Salish territory here in Seattle. And I'm really sorry I can't be with everybody in person, but thank you for watching this video. And I just want to contribute what I can to this incredible panel. Really sorry not to be able to join some very amazing experts that you're about to hear from in the Black Lives Matter at School movement. But I just wanted to say a word about how this movement started in Seattle and some of the ongoing activism that we're participating in to uproot anti-Blackness in our schools and transform our schools into places that nurture and heal rather than shame and label and especially target our Black kids. And back in 2016, there was a really innovative school, elementary school named John Muir Elementary, where the educators there wanted to support their Black students. And this was coming off of a summer where Philando Castile and Alton Sterling had been killed, and many of our Black students were traumatized by that. And so they wanted to let the students know from the very beginning of the school year that they were nurtured and supported, and that Black students would be taken care of at that school. And so they wanted to hold a celebration of Blackness at the school in September. And to do that, they partnered with the PTA and a group called Black Men United to Change the Narrative with Deshaun Jackson. And the art teacher, amazing art teacher named Julie Trout, designed a shirt that said, "Black Lives Matter, we stand together." John Muir Elementary School with a beautiful picture of a tree. And then word got out that teachers would be wearing these Black Lives Matter shirts, and some hateful white supremacists began bombarding the school with hate mail. And then a particularly hateful person made a bomb threat against an elementary school just because they wanted to support their Black students. It was horrific, and the school district officially canceled the event. They brought in bomb-sniffing dogs that morning. And so a friend of mine, Professor Wayne Au, his son went to that school, and he put me in touch with the educators, and we brought those educators to a meeting of our Social Equity Educators Caucus in the union. And we came up with the idea of passing a resolution to support John Muir Elementary, but we knew that if we really supported John Muir, we would all wear those shirts to school. So the resolution called on every educator to come to school on October 19th wearing a shirt that says Black Lives Matter. And we called on educators to teach about the long Black freedom struggle and institutional racism and the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, we passed the resolution, but then the hard part came next, because we knew that if only a few teachers wore the shirts on October 19th, that also would send a message to our Black students. And so then we had to really organize, and we partnered with the Black student unions and the NAACP, and the PTA of Seattle voted to endorse, and we had press conferences and teach-ins. And come October 19th, we had some 3,000 out of the 5,000 educators in the Seattle public schools come to school wearing that shirt that said Black Lives Matter. It was just an eruption of solidarity. And it was so exciting to see that there was real potential to build a movement around fighting anti-Blackness in our schools. And, you know, the media picked up our story. It got widely reported around the country. And what happened next just truly made my heart soar. The incredible educators in Philly, they took it to the next level. They saw our day of action and they expanded it to a week of action. And the incredible educator Tamara Anderson decided that we needed to break down the 13 principles of the Black Lives Matter Global Network into teaching points for each day of the week. And they were just some visionaries there in Philadelphia that had the first week of action. And that week of action is what inspired the rest of the country to join in this movement. And I will let some of the other panelists explain how it became a national movement, but I'll just say that I was so uplifted to see this past February during our 4th annual National Week of Action, the week of action tripled in size this year. There were communities all across our country. We had more in the South than ever. We even had communities in Canada registering for Black Lives Matter at School Week, bringing this to become an international movement now. And I know that we're just at the very beginning of a process, but we have a movement. And this movement has demands for transforming pedagogy in the classroom to make it anti-racist, but also around dismantling the structures of institutional racism. And I am going to let the other panelists talk about those demands, but I'm just so happy to be in this struggle with all of you. And we will be in it until our schools see our Black students as full human beings worthy of our love. So thank you for having me today.
What a powerful history. I've learned so much just from that short video. I am going to hand it over to Chris Rogers to give us the Philadelphia side of the story and also to talk more about the curriculum.
Thank you, Natasha. And thank you to Jesse, who pre-records and still sets me up wonderfully. So that's perfect. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So as Jesse mentioned, Black Lives Matter at School really flowered out of Philadelphia, right? With this sort of like intervention of extending this day of action into a full week. So during that time, this was like around 2016 to 2017 school year, members of the Caucus of Working Educators would be like the Racial Justice Committee of the Caucus Working Educators, which have eventually, become its own independent organization called the Racial Justice Organizing Committee. Was the context in Philadelphia, right, is thinking of our relationship to racial justice movements, recognizing the demographics of teachers, particularly in Philadelphia, somewhere close to around 80% of our teachers are white women, in a city where its biggest quote unquote minority class is Black Americans, and our school district in Philadelphia is majority students of color. So thinking of this gap, right? The work of the union or the teachers union was really about pushing more teachers to get embedded with the ongoing community organizing that was happening across Philadelphia, where there's groups like Black Lives Matter Philly chapter, our the coalition, which is called now is the Black Philly Radical Collective, but at that time featured organizations like Philly for Real Justice. We have a long history of Black radical organizing. That's can even mention the Move organization, and I definitely on today of all days I want people to look up the campaign to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, which is in a huge mobilization today. So it's important to talk about that context, but this is the environment that's all around us, but what is its inroads into our classrooms, into our schools, right? So expanding on tenets of social justice unionism, of which, the Chicago Teachers Union kind of plays a central role in, leading, and then also growing our relationships with local Black-led organizing was some of the sort of like foundation for how the Black Lives Matter at School rally comes together. And Tamara Anderson, as Jesse mentioned, thought about taking the principles, these 13 principles that were on the Black Lives Matter official network website, and using those to sort of frame out a way of engaging with the I could say like the ideas of intersectional racial justice that grounded these movements in the streets. And this flyer you see here is from the 2021 campaign, which is led by the Racial Justice Organizing Committee. And then you see this amazing graphic. They have shirts available. You can buy those and stuff like that. All right, let me keep going. So that first year in 2016, 2017, at the end of it, right, there's this amazing conference that I want everybody to know about called Free Minds, Free Peoples. It's the conference of the Education for Liberation Network. And that year it was in Baltimore, Maryland. And that was the time upon which we brought all the sort of like spreadsheets, curriculum, event ideas, and things together, and really got to connect with people in Chicago, people in Oakland, people in Denver, people in Boston, and Okaikor and the work they were doing in Jersey. Like, so many groups came together, and we really moved from just Philly into this national coalition. And with that, we also felt it was critically important to think about how we are leveraging this movement to think about demands of educational policy. So you see these four things: ending zero tolerance policies, mandating Black history and ethnic studies, hiring more Black teachers and educators and counselors, not cops, or what might be called in this year, particularly with the youth organizers on the front, police free schools. So I just want to give a shout out to that, how that all connects, right? So it's not just about lessons that we are teaching in the classroom. It is also about how we are creating transformative educational policy. So on the left here, you see the Black Lives Matter Week of Action guiding principles, right? And these are all through our curriculum, all through our website. And really it emerges from a study of really, and I think Charlene Carruthers' book. Charlene Carruthers, who is formerly of BYP 100, put out a book called Unapologetic, right? And it's sort of like grounding a Black queer feminist approach. So those tenets of the Black Lives Matter official network, you can think of Unapologetic and this Black queer feminist approach, are huge in how we ground our work. So what do I do, right, in curriculum? So I'm the curriculum co-chair. And every year, we sort of re-release a huge swath of resources that are taking these principles and connecting them to like primary source materials, history, and ways of analyzing present conditions all around the country and outside the country as well, to think about how can we apply these principles as tools of analysis, and how can we use them to seed community organizing. And it's important to say that what we do and what I do is from a national level. So we're sort of coordinating these things into like this national Google Drive. But if you're in every city where there is a collective of Black Lives Matter school educators, they're thinking on a local level of what these things can look like and tying them to organizations and collectives that are present on the ground, and saying how can their experiences shape what we are teaching in our classrooms. So all these links you see on these slides are live. You can look them up. I'll definitely try to put the link to this presentation in the chat once I'm done. And so really, everything's on Google Drive, right? And sometimes, having my name up here where I'm the owner of this thing sometimes gets you into trouble. There was a time in where they said that the Black Lives Matter at school was, it was like this right-wing conspiracy that we were trying to indoctrinate kids. We had this leaked curriculum. And I was trying to tell people, like, we spent a lot of time trying to promote this across the country. This is not being leaked. We got our names on it. You can find it. So I just say that to say the curriculum is out there. I highly encourage everyone to look through it, check out the many different resources. And if you want to talk more about right-wing challenges to people's curriculum, people's histories, and we can talk about the rise of anti-trans legislation in this country, something important that we need to confront. We can talk about that a little bit later. So this year, we've added this new piece called the Year of Purpose, which was, after the uprisings of last year, we really wanted to think about how we could really push this invitation into a full year sort of like program. And alongside myself, Okaikor, and as well as Maria Fernandez, who does amazing work with the Alliance for Educational Justice, came up with these questions, these self-reflection questions. And I just want to, read a couple, because I think it's important that folks do not see our curriculum as just something to consume, something to just download, a piece of work, but rather see it as an entry point into study, or as Education for Liberation Network will remind us, these are inquiries, I never get that word right, inquiries to action, right? So how do you move from just asking questions into action? And these questions kind of work for anybody, students, educators, parents. What is our school's relationship to Black community organizing? Do we have relationships with local movement organizers? Do they see our school as a place that believes in their mission? Do they see our school as a place to connect with local families? How are school-wide policies and practices applied across categories of race? Do problematic patterns emerge when we look at how policies are applied to Black students? And we also consider the intersections of gender, sexual orientation, and disability with Blackness. I could read more. If you go to the link here that's at the bottom, you can find out all the questions. There's more, definitely. And I'll also talk about what we do in the Year of Purpose. It's also about, every month we give new invitations, right? So in October, we came up with this, plan of reimagine everything, right? Drawing on the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Grace Lee Boggs, and Audre Lorde. And thinking not how can we, continue to rehearse and spread narratives of Black pain and trauma, but how do we, take the serious struggle to create new worlds, right? And begin there, right? So this was an opportunity to sort of like change how people were discussing the murder of George Floyd in schools, to think about not just the replaying of this pain, but rather how can we use this as an opportunity to think about the movements and resistance that came out of that moment, and how we can use that to imagine what's next and what's possible. And then this month, right, we're in the month of revolutionary Black arts. So we're thinking about folks like Zora Neale Hurston, Faith Ringgold, Alma Thomas, Augusta Savage, Jasmine Mance, looking at their legacies as Black women artists and thinking about how what they have put into their art can create the potential to reflect on the world or to imagine alternatives to the world, to the oppressive conditions that we live in. So these are the type of things that we're doing, right? And then that always ends with this question, right? How are the themes and radical vision that they brought to their art reflected in your classrooms and communities? How can young people extend on these legacies? So these are like very broad questions, right? Because we're asking teachers to come in and think about their own individual context and find out ways to really, right size and fit and allow space for you to make connections with local artists and also what's happening in your local communities, to think about this grounded relationship between schools, educators, community organizers, Black history, Black legacies. And it's just a cycle, right? So every year we get a new chance to think about what are ideas that are out there, what are new histories that we need to recover, and what are strategies that we can, really take to build our resistance within, but also beyond schools. So I'll end there. I don't know how much time that was. Hopefully it wasn't too long. And thank you for the time. I look forward to talking with you all during questions.
Thank you so much. And I'm expecting many folks to have questions about the curriculum development. If not, I do. So I'll be following up very soon. Now we turn to Dr. Okaikor Price to talk more about the formation and investment from Black community organizing. So take it away.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Flowers and Chris.
Hey, Mom. Oh, sorry. My
bad. So we're in a place where home and work kind of merge together all the time. So you just met my daughter, Sage. But yes, so in terms of organizing, so Black Lives Matter School, when we first started out, like I remember our first meeting when we first got together after, because right before, and Chris talked about folks meeting up at Free Minds, Free People, that being a central place for it to kickstart some of these ideas, which is an important place. It's an important starting place because we talk about this national organizing landscape. Free Minds, Free People is central, has been central to that, or was central to that, right? And then we moved to this, like, if you think about that year, We also had, that was the year that the Charlottesville, the folks had, the white supremacists had stormed, the torchbearers, the tiki torchbearers had stormed Charlottesville. And we decided, groups of us had decided we were going to do a Charlottesville teach-in. We had some in New Jersey, Philly had done some, and we were talking about coming together and doing this national work. And I think with a lot of these movements and a lot of these instances, what sparks is this shock, right? The shock to our system that these terrible things are going on, and you've got a multi-ethno-racial group of people immediately coming together with a desire to organize and work together because yes, this thing is terrible and we need to organize to undo it and unravel it and create a better world. But we also understand that there are power dynamics that are at play too, because when we came into this multi-ethno-racial space, it wasn't initially a Black-led space, which actually speaks to, after a couple of our meetings, we were like, hey, we need to rethink how we actually structure this. We're talking about Black Lives Matter at School. Yes, we need an organizing group of people, and it needs to be multi-ethno-racial. If we think about every movement in this country that has shifted power and that's caused our country to make change was Black-led, people of color-led, but it was a multi-ethno-racial group, right, of folks coming together to shift and change, right? It's every movement that we had, and led by working poor people, right? So that's another thing that we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about having not only an analysis of race, but also analysis of class, right? And how that also plays into this. And so we decided we were going to structurally organize ourselves so that our steering committee was going to be a Black-led steering committee, right? And then the organizing groups can be the multi-ethno-racial, right? So we're taking direction from a leadership body that was being led by Black folks, right? That are making decisions, that is constructing what we want this thing to look like. And when I write about the organizing work that we were doing, because I think when we think about how critical the organizing work is, and to see ourselves as organizers, to stretch out, that it's not just going to be teachers, because clearly at the time, I wasn't even in the classroom at the time anymore. Because of anti-Blackness, I was pushed out of the classroom and then still committed to this work. But we said, look, this needs to be parents, it needs to be community folks, it needs to be educators, right? And we need to be pushing and forcing our unions, forcing our institutions, forcing our organizations to make change. A quote that actually comes to mind for me, it's a quote that in one of the texts by I.E. Arma. And he says, they pretend that somehow in some magical way, the academic system designed for African enslavement can be retooled. Hold on, I'm on a,
oh, my bad.
You see the people I live with?
Oh, well, I take your gift back then, damn it.
Sorry, folks.
Yeah.
See, my daughter will continue to enter into these spaces whenever she used to go to a lot of protests with me, everything. Like, so she's used to, so this Zoom space is not allowing her to be as present as she would like to be. So anyway, but we, what I was saying about how we were pushed to push our unions into forcing that change that we needed them to make, because it cannot happen and it will not happen within the institution. The institution won't change itself. It's going to take the pushing of, for those of us on the outside. But Arma says they pretend that somehow in some magical way, the academic system designed for African enslavement can be retooled into an instrument for African liberation. It cannot. So I want us to kind of sit with that quote, because I think it's almost relative to the Audre Lorde's, you can't take the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, in a similar light, right? And so we know that Black Lives Matter at School is not the end. It's a vehicle that we're using to get us toward liberation, right? It's a tool that we're using in this moment in time that's going to push us to transform our schools, our unions, all the institutions that started off built on anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, right? We have to, those two things are playing at once, right? The dispossession of land, right? The commodifying of land, the theft of land, and the theft of Black people, right? And so those two things are playing out. So we understand that as part of our organizing work. And so when we, in terms of structurally how we did this, we said, look, we need to make sure we're working with all folks, and we're bringing in parents and teachers and community folks so that we can transform and push our institutions to at least chip away, right? So this chipping away at the system, right? Toward, like, you know, there's a lot of folks that are like, oh, defund to abolish, but I think that's really truly what this is. It's like defund to abolish. And then there's not that everything is completely bad. There are some good things about what we already have. I think Bruce Wilson Gilmore talks about a lot of things we're not talking about. There's some good things happening, right? Let's find those good things, and how can we expand and make those much more expansive and beautiful, and kind of become our normal way of being, our way of being with each other and being in community with each other. The other thing that I want to kind of speak to in terms of the organizing work is just being, how important it was to be strategic and making sure that we were pushing this conversation. And it's not that, so I think it's a both and, like, we do believe that the unions are important. Unions are extremely important for workers, for students, for advocating and creating learning environments that are going to be transformative for students. But we also understand that there's a problematic history around that too as well, with unions being very white, because most, as Chris mentioned, that majority of the teachers in our nation are, what, 82 to 86% white. Many of them never having to have to encounter and be in community in true authentic relationships with people of color, right? Until they maybe go into a school or district where they're more diverse people. They may go to college and they make it, but it's very limited, right? Because we know there's a lot of researchers looking at, like, some white folks don't even have people of color friends, Black friends, right? Because we live in a society that has been manufactured to create that for them. So we said, like, look, this language that we're pushing out is really to shift the conversation, is to transform the pedagogy, is to transform how we build relationships, how we see Black children, right? It's almost like a, you know, it's nonstop. It's on, like, it's you know, it's nonstop. It's an onslaught of, like, we're not going to stop. We're going to continue until we see this transformation. And what's really important for the work that we're doing, there's so many other people doing similar work and other kinds of work, that it really does, like, having these multiple, like, having our institutions, having our systems, having our organizations being hit at multiple angles, right? And being pushed to transform at multiple angles is what's shifting and causing this shift. Because back in 2014, to say Black Lives Matter at school would not have been heard of, right? You would get targeted in your classroom, which is similar to what I did, like teaching, when I taught in Hackensack Public Schools in New Jersey, teaching, 43% of my students were Black, 47 were Latinx, a very smaller percent, but yet being told that, no, you can't teach Tupac changes, because if you taught that, I'll be in the next day to have some words with that teacher, right? Or being told that you could teach certain things, and then to even mention Black Lives Matter, right? So what's happened, what I love about this is the power of organizing. And it's not just us, right? It's, of course, it's now a global. We know that this is global. Black Lives Matter, the network, is such a global enterprise. It's a global organizing effort, rather. But the fact that I can go to multiple different states, I'm calling in from this state, calling from that state, and people have been touched by Black Lives Matter at school, it speaks to the organizing that we have done in order to make that happen. And then last thing, even for us within our organizing network, we run into conflict, right, with each other. And so for us, we say, well, what does it mean for us to understand that and embrace the conflict and embrace it in a restorative and transformative way so that we can be better organizers on the outside, right? So even within our group, the steering committee, and then I can even say, like in the chapter in the book that we have, I write this chapter with Raquel James. She was a teacher I taught with, but she talks about, we both talk, I'm interviewing, but in this small little interview we're talking about how we were friends, but then because of anti-Blackness, it broke up, it dismembered our friendship. But then what does it mean for us to reconcile and then to move in principled relationship with each other and principled struggle with each other so that we can continue this organizing work together? And that's it.
My goodness, thank you so much. Just the idea of principled struggle. I hope that we can get back to that, as well as more examples of working through some of the conflicts and getting to better understandings. Something is happening with my Zoom here. I'm going to try. Why is it saying start video? Okay. Jason and Laverne, don't go anywhere now. I don't want anything to happen. Okay, so without further ado, we are going to move to Dr. Denisha Jones. And oh gosh, well, just good evening. And I'm just going to hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flowers. Thank you all for being here. It's so great always to be in conversation with Chris and Okaikor and Jesse's video. We all know the story, but we love to hear him tell it because it's a great way to really talk about how this work got started. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we call the section I called in the book, educators doing the work, right? And I know it sounds a little crazy, but I just was like, how do I frame what it is that teachers are doing in this movement? And it's just work. And they're just showing up and they're doing the work. And so I've had the privilege of organizing with teachers in DC, in the DC area, and then also with teachers now in New York City, right? So I've seen organizing around this in different levels. I'm also in the higher ed space, and so I've also seen how higher ed professors and faculty members are also organizing. And that was really why, you know, we wanted to get this story out, right? It was so much great, amazing work that was happening each week, right? And I felt like we needed to share this with people. And so in my chapter in the book, I talk about what I'm calling the Black Lives Matter at School pedagogy, because it really is a way of being for these teachers, a way of thinking about the work they do with children, with Black children and all children, and the work and why they do it, and the what of their doing, like how are they making this different, right? You know, in a lot of ways, it's extending on the call for culturally relevant pedagogy and curriculum that we've had from scholars like Gloria Ladson-Billings and Geneva Gay, right? And it's taking that to a next level, right? And this idea of like, you know, Bettina Love's work on abolitionist teaching, right? This idea of anti-racism. And so it's all coming together, I think, in this way that shows that we are continuing the work of others that have started before us. And so one way that I think makes what the teachers are doing that makes this work so unique in this pedagogy is that they are affirming Blackness. And that's very much the opposite of what traditionally happens in schools, right? Most public school education is about promoting, whether explicitly or implicitly, right, Black inferiority through the narratives that we tell about Black people and their history. And so in this work, right, we're really saying, no, we're affirming Black students, Black families, Black communities, Black culture. And it's not, affirming Blackness doesn't mean anti-white people, right? It's not about that. It's about creating a space where we can say, Black children are brilliant. I love Black children. I love Black people, and I want the best for them. And I don't have to apologize for that. And one of the things I love when I see the teachers, what we talk about, because everyone thinks that, you know, Black Lives Matter School is teaching about police brutality. And that's no, I mean, that might come up, right? Because we're dealing with that as a society issue, but that's not the grounding. It's about teaching for Black joy. And I teach college students, and when I bring that up and I say, what does that mean to you to teach for Black joy? And they're stuck because no one's ever asked them about that. They don't really know what Black joy is and what Black joy means, and they don't have a reference for that. So we're giving the world a reference for that, right? that we're going to teach for Black joy, and we're going to teach Black humanity, because white supremacy is about making people believe that there is no humanity in Blackness. And we know that's not true, right? And so that's really important, because we have to change the narrative about how we're traditionally taught about Black people, right? So Jesse, who you heard from earlier, before we did this book, he co-edited a book called Teaching for Black Lives. And it's a really great book. I use it in my diversity class that I teach online for Howard University each fall, because it really shows you how to get beyond the traditional ways that we teach Black history, right? Or just teach history about Black people. Beyond the transatlantic slave trade, beyond the civil rights, and beyond the myth of post-racial heroes like Obama and Oprah, right? Those are the three typical things. You ask anybody, what do you know about Black people? I know about slavery, I know about Harriet Tubman, I know about Rosa Parks, Dr. King, maybe a little Malcolm X, and that's it. Oh, and then everything's over now because Obama is president, right? And it's like getting beyond that and teaching about the Black struggle through a lens of Black community organizing, right? Thinking about the Black Panthers as Black community organizers, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as Black community organizing, Black political thought, right? How did these leaders advance the fight for freedom, right? Instead of teaching about the enslavement of Africans, how about we teach about how presidents of the United States owned slaves? And why that's important to the history of this country, and to understand that, right? So using that text, it's very helpful, right, to see that there's another way. And that's what we're bringing out in this curriculum that Chris talked about, that we put. It's not your typical lessons, because we're not trying to share that typical knowledge. We are teaching for Black joy. So the 13 guiding principles are things that uplift Black people in their communities, right? Black villages, Black families, Black women, unapologetically Black, right? Empathy, restorative justice, diversity, globalism, trans affirming, queer affirming, intergenerational, loving engagement, right? These are things that most people don't associate with thinking about with Black people, because they've never had that frame of reference before as well too. So the affirming of Blackness is really important. I see teachers doing this. I'm fortunate to be interviewing teachers who are doing this work, and I hear their need to affirm Blackness even in all white spaces, right? And we do have white teachers doing this work. I saw that question in the Q&A, so I might as well get to it now, right? There's a chapter in the book called White Teachers for Black Lives. Now, as Okaikor mentioned, we are all Black at the National Steering Committee level, but in almost every city you go to do this organizing, guess who's gonna show up? White teachers, because they make up 87% of the teaching force, right? There's not going to be a space where it's just all Black teachers. If you're, it'd be great, right? But it's not. In DC, tons of white teachers. In New York City, we have white teachers on our New York City steering committee, right? And so they understand that this is important. Some of them teach in Black spaces, in Black and brown spaces, so they know this is important. But some of them teach in predominantly white spaces, and they also know this is important, because they know that when they're teaching a white 5-year-old that Black lives matter, right, that this child is going to remember that when they're older and someone's telling them that no, Black lives don't matter. They're going to know that, no, I had a white teacher who told me something else, right? There's another way to think about the messages that I'm receiving in society about Black people, right? And so it's important to lay that foundation and to affirm that Blackness. And it's also important to resist neoliberal reforms, right, that are harming all students, but particularly Black students in our schools, right? The curriculum that's narrow, that doesn't have any relevance to their lives, right? The testing, right, the high-stakes standardized testing that we know is damaging to children before a pandemic, and it's even going to be worse now. That this myth of an achievement gap, which is actually, as Ibram Kennedy calls it, a really racist idea, right? And actually focusing on what Gloria Ladson-Billings taught us is the opportunity gaps, right? And so through the push of our demands, we push about what that opportunity looks like, right? What that stolen opportunity looks like when we say we want restorative justice in schools and no more zero tolerance, right? That's that opportunity taken away from children who are everyday policed instead of receiving the help that they need in school, who simple acts of being a child, right, throwing a temper tantrum could lead to handcuffs and arrest if you're a young Black child, right? So we're taking that back in that demand. Hire more Black teachers. When I was in DC, we had a youth-led event, and they asked them to, go stand in the corner, the 4-corner thing, about one of the demands that resonate with you. And I went over to the Black teachers' demand, and a lot of students were there, and we got to hear the students talk about it. And in DC, a city that was Chocolate City, now is, gentrifying to more of a mocha city. But you've got Black high school students who have never had a Black teacher. How is that possible in our nation's capital, right? And they talk about when they finally get one, how much it helps them adjust in that school year to just have a teacher who looks like them, who gets it, and who is responsive to their needs, right? So that's another opportunity stolen from our children, that we don't have enough Black teachers, and it's intentional. In places like New Orleans, when they intentionally fired Black teachers after Hurricane Katrina, and turned it over to an all-charter district. But it goes beyond that, right? The work of, and now I'm going to blank on her name, it's going to come to me. She's a scholar, I believe, out of, now the whole school is blanking on me, in the South, in Georgia, who's done the historical analysis of what happened to Black teachers in Black schools when we had integration, right? And with the unions.
Walker.
Yes, thank you. Vanessa Siddle-Walker at Emory. That's what I was trying to say, right? And she talks about how, all the Black teachers were, after they were promised that they would be taken into the union and brought into the school district, they were fired. And we turned our Black children over to a hostile white teaching force who never wanted them in the first place. And yet we are surprised to see something manufactured known as an achievement gap, right? So we know we need Black teachers. We know that we need ethnic studies and Black history taught in all schools, right? Arizona taught us this, right? That when Mexican-American students learn their history, guess what? They do well in school. They graduate, they go to college. And that freaked out the white supremacists in Arizona so much that they tried to ban ethnic studies, because it was helping those students, right? And we know that, Philadelphia is, I think, maybe the only city, Chris, that has a mandate for a Black history course. I don't know any other city that does that, right? And so why isn't that happening across the country, where students are taking Black history and learning real Black history in their classes, and ethnic studies as well, too? And lastly, we know that there's an opportunity gap in who gets policed and who doesn't. And we know that our students go to schools without counselors, without psychiatrists, without psychologists, but they have plenty of cops. And we know that's unjust, and that's not what we want in this world. So we see the teachers resisting the idea that Black children need to be surveilled, right? And they're saying no to that. They're pushing for these demands. They're engaging with the youth. And what I see a lot, and what's been amazing here in New York City and other places, is how much they're allowing the youth to lead this movement. In New York City, we've gone from having a youth day event to a youth council, where they did the whole thing. And if you weren't a young person, I didn't even get to go this year. Last year, I got to run around and buy them snacks and buy them drinks, because that's what an adult with a car does when the youth is in charge. They sent me everywhere. And that was great, because they didn't need me for anything. They needed me to support them in that way. This year, it was all virtual, 100% youth-led, and it was amazing. And I know other cities are doing that, right? Howard County, Maryland, the students at Wild Lake High School are doing it. They're leading this movement. So they're not even just affirming Black children, they're allowing them to lead, and they're showing the world what happens when you trust Black children to be in charge of their education. They are so good at it. They want so much. There's so much that they want to accomplish, right? And lastly, we're creating a space to dream about what this world we want really looks like, right? One of the things the curriculum committee does is the student creative challenge every year. And it's been amazing to issue these prompts and to ask students to creatively respond to, what does a school look like where Black lives matter? What are the windows and mirrors, right, that provide safe spaces for Black people? What does it mean to thrive in Black communities, right? And we're creating that space, which is so important for these kids to freedom dream, for them to show that they do have visions of a world where they are liberated people. And so that's important also. And so the work happens, it's just amazing how much it continues to happen, right? I was a little worried, COVID, virtual, I was like, oh, no one's gonna show up. We had more teachers at every New York City planning meeting this January during COVID than we would have had in person on CUNY somewhere. We had 96 or more educators come in each week, and they sign up and they do amazing things, right? And white educators let us lead. They take direction from the Black educators. They do what's necessary to support the movement. They don't try and overstep, right? And they're held accountable to the work, which is really important in that space. Not everyone, right? We still have some spaces where, white people come in, they trying to get their little check. I did Black Lives Matter badge. It doesn't work that way, right? So if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, if these principles leave you stuck, if you can't imagine teaching for Black joy, then before you do this poorly to your students, how about you take it on yourself and go what I call action research project and do this yourself, right? And really answer those reflection questions that Chris mentioned that are on our website. Think about your relationship to the Black community. Think about what you know about Black people that is not rooted in slavery, civil rights, and special Black people who've made it to the top, right? How can we reframe that narrative? Do the work yourself so that you are ready to do this work with your students because they are ready for you to do it. Thank you.
My goodness, I promised y'all a revival, so this is what we're going to get tonight. Thank you so much for answering David Hurd's question about, white teachers' investment in Black Lives Matter at school. I do want to ask the question. I'm thinking about, and I believe we have one person in the chat. And I'm just assuming that this question could have been in the Q&A as well. She's asking about infusing this conversation in her job's work with and about inequities in our division. And we don't have a lot of detail based on that question, but the question itself reminds me of our Black teachers invested, committed, but because of the demographics and because of anti-Blackness, running rampant everywhere in schools and in districts. What do you say to, teachers who have solo status, or it's just, one or two of them, they're reading together, they're talking together, but there is some stagnancy there where they're stuck in the upset, the anger, the frustration, but they want to do the work. What do you say to those teachers?
I think so there are a lot of times as Black teachers, we might be the only one, right? What has been really interesting about this time is that there's a lot of virtual communities that are being created, that people are creating their own affinity spaces. When I felt alone when I was teaching in Hackensack, because I was like one of the few Black teachers there, though I was predominantly students of color. Social media was a great way for me to get tapped into other educators, and there are communities that are being created there. The other thing is I would not suggest that people do work by themselves. And that's where when we're thinking about organizing, like if you go out and you start saying Black Lives Matter School and you're the only Black teacher, particularly in communities where it's predominantly white and very conservative, or they're just not ready for it, I would continue to emphasize the importance of building community with like-minded folks, because you won't be able to get through this alone. Even if it means like finding enough white folks who are accomplices, building with them, connecting with parents and community, building with other educators outside. Like you just cannot go at it alone, because you will immediately get squashed. Like you will immediately get burnt out. You will immediately get tossed out, chewed up and spit out again, right? And so my advice is to find community, even if it's a virtual community, but find community, create the community. There are people that are there. You just got like, how do I go out and find them? Parents, community folks that are already doing organizing. But a lot of times we think that we're the only ones who are thinking this way and that we're the only ones doing it. There are folks already doing it. It really does take us having to look in and dig deeper into seeing like what's actually happening in the landscape that I'm in right now in this moment. I'm working with a group of teachers in another state that's predominantly white. And what they said is they found out that there were a lot of times they might have been the only one in their school. And what happens is a lot of these districts will make them the only one. There might be a lot of schools in the district, but they'll be the only one in each one of those schools. Mm-hmm. Tapping into finding out like, okay, let's find my people. My people are somewhere. Let's find them and let's create community, right? And that's actually what these teachers did. They found each other. They were like, wait, what? You've been around here all this time? Yes, I've been around here all this time. And then creating intentional communities rooted in, and that's going to go back to these principles, rooted in principles that clear organizing principles that is about, understanding the importance of building relationships. That is about understanding how racism and anti-Blackness and white supremacy impact our students, our own selves individually, internally and externally. That talks about how do we develop relationships, build leadership, how do we understand internalized racial oppression as it plays a lot of folks are pushing Tima Okun's white supremacy culture, right? They've been pushing that out. Like, how does that's showing up in your organization, that shows up in us, that shows up in other folks. So all of that is things that people can do, right? Find your people, create your group, your network, build with them, grow with them, develop with them, analyze power with them, organize with them, and then commit to transforming the conditions for yourself and the other Black students that you're having to serve.
Thank you. I appreciate that. A couple of more questions, and then I'm going to go back to our attendees because I'm seeing some questions. So just hold on. I'm coming back to you. And one is very long. Thank you for your thoroughness. I will be right there. So my other question is related to the early curriculum development. So there are teachers online now who certainly are familiar with the traditional way, either it's scripted or you do some inquiry on your own and you make it work, you do what needs to be done. But I just think this is a great time for folks to hear more about the transformative way to go about curriculum development for Black lives. So tell us more, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, first and foremost is to, recognize that as Black Lives Matter at School, we come into this tradition. And while we have the new technologies of Google and the internet, if you look at, early 1920s, Carter G. Woodson is starting the American Association for, oh my God, ASALA. And the birth of Negro History Week is really a curricular organizing project where he's asking Black educators across the country to think about and collect. Negro History Week is really a collection of the lessons that are being curated by Black educators all across the country, and thinking of this as a cycle of how we continue to build new and grander lessons about Black histories, about Black strategies for freedom. So there's a long history of this curriculum building that's important to acknowledge. But in terms of the technologies and how we're doing it today, it's really, and I love what, in terms of what Okaikor talked about finding community and thinking outside the box of our schools. When we think about just the multitude of texts that are being produced and created in the midst of resistance movements, the manifestos, the ways of analyzing, look at this defund police movements. Think of the mathematical strategies that are there. Think about how it's being, connected to think about things such as healthcare, the things such as housing. So that these interdisciplinary projects are right in front of us all the time. What we do, right, what's different for us is we are, just providing a new context to say, teachers, teach this, right? So I think in that work, there's a hashtag Teach Outside the Textbook that I know the Zen Education Project is huge with, and I'll put their information in there as well. They have an amazing series that Jesse Hagopian is part of right now called, Conversations on the Black Freedom Struggle. But so there are a lot of text and primary sources and things that are out there, just like a PDF search away. And what we do with the curriculum is we're just pulling those things together and saying, how could this be useful in an elementary school classroom, in a middle school classroom? And just thinking of those as invitations, but also, and this is important because you talked about scripting, we are not we are still putting it in educators and community hands to say, you have to think about how this relates to your own experience. What's happening in your communities, right? What are the campaigns that are ongoing? Because wherever there is a Black community, responding to, matters of injustice, there are strategies that are being taken up. So you start there, right? You start by seeing what's around you, and then you connect that history to it, right? So it's about taking stock of what's happening in your environment, what campaigns, what lessons are there, thinking out of the box in terms of, interdisciplinary, becoming undisciplined in some way, to not just think of what we're ever teaching is just mathematics or just English language arts, but it has a connection across it all. And seeing, how we continue to build these things up. So that's what the magic of the curriculum is. And all people ask me of like, do you think these are like the greatest, like, I don't think that there is the such thing as like this greatest lesson, so to speak, or there's this, one lesson that is going to solve racism and anti-Blackness in our country. Stop. What it is an accumulation, it's a daily practice of taking stock of our environment, taking a look around, realizing what's going on, and just creating opportunities and building relationships. And through that accumulation, we get things such as the civil rights movement. We get things such as, these, wider anti-colonial movements across the African continent. If you look at what Amilcar Cabral was doing in Guinea-Bissau and Angola, in terms of the educational curriculum that was there, there's an amazing book, maybe I'll put it in the chat, from Sonia Vaz Borges, that talks about they're building a curriculum about how you are teaching the resistance, teaching anti-colonial resistance to elementary school students. So I'll just stop there, but thank you for the invitation. And yes.
I'm just talking away and on mute. It happens at least one time every session, class, it does not matter. And I forgot to mention, first of all, we forgot to say hello to Okaikor's daughter. So we're gonna say hello to her and say, we hear you, and we didn't see you, but we heard you, and it is all right. Now I wanna go back, and I do want to hear from Okaikor on this, given what she said earlier about organizing and the struggle and the conflict, but please, Denisha and Chris, chime in as well. I feel strongly that some folks start any type of activism work, it's a lot of idealism, a lot of warm and fuzzy feelings, and we're all just working toward the goal of life and success and again, Black joy. But people hesitate to talk publicly about some of the, the not so great entanglements and conflicts that come with doing this work. So if you could speak to what that might look like and some of the resolution on the other side. Because some people might be struggling with folks they've been working with and don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, so I think one of the things, and this kind of came from just because I've been doing organizing work for quite a while, one of the things that I've realized the importance of us embracing conflict, right? And when conflict does show up, how do we name that conflict and address it head on? I think part of what some of our conditioning has been, either whether it's through schooling or just in society or whatever, is that we avoid conflict. When it shows up, we just tiptoe around it, we don't name it. And then what ends up happening is it all starts to fester. It's like putting your garbage can under the sink, right? And leaving it there all summer long. And they're piling up. You're throwing in the scraps, you're throwing in pieces of meat that you no longer want, right? Raw meat, whatever, and it piles up. And then what ends up happening?
Yeah. Spoils and stinks, honey.
It spoils and stinks. Now you might have had it hidden under the sink and nobody's gonna see it. But if I'm not in your house and I walk in, I'm like, ooh. Because you can sense even when people are having conflict and they don't know how to be in relationship with each other. And so even for me, it's also, this also recently came up a lot during the recent uprisings from the summer, is that youth will come into organizing spaces very quickly. They'd never been in relationship with each other ever before. And suddenly they're coming into relationship with each other. They hit a brick wall because they've come into some conflict and they don't know how to deal with it. Because all they know is that, hey, we have this thing that we hate, let's organize against it. But then not understanding what are some principles that we should be doing, embracing while we're trying to organize together. How do we embrace this conflict and address it head on? Because if we just ignore it, it's going to blow up into something very different, even worse than what it was before. It's going to not just be conflict, it might even be hurt and harm and abuse, right? Abuse of power and all sorts of different things that show. And so I saw that in so many different organizing spaces. And for us, I mean, it hasn't been where we want to go to blows with each other, but it's been like, hey, y'all moving too fast. Why y'all moving so fast? Let's name this. What's showing up in this moment? What is a sense of urgency? How are we making decisions without making sure everyone has an input, and then we're just going forward with it? How are we making decisions about something when we know that, or we haven't considered all the ways that this might cause harm or hurt to someone else, right? And so we've been able to address it and name it, like, hey, name that this is the issue. We have a dialogue about it, a conversation about it, and not just shy away from it. And then apologies are made, people walk away, and we're like, good. Now we're better for it because we literally struggled. We used principled struggle to get through this issue together, right? And I think for more organizations need to do more of this, like name that they struggled together within their organization, but also name how they work through that conflict together, right? Because it will be instructive and educative for folks who are going to be coming behind, not so much so they can learn from our mistakes, but then learn about what questions are we not asking ourselves in this moment that can help better prepare us, better help us better create an environment and a community that will help us be in right relationship with each other. And to be in right relationship with each other is a very spiritual concept, right? Because it's not just with other human beings, but with the earth, right? The land, right? With all of nature, right? And so for so long, our conditioning, our social conditioning, we have not been in right relationship. We're not in right relationship with the land right now. If we're being truly honest, the land that we're on right now, we're not in right relationship with. And until we can get in right relationship with other human beings, right, and the land, we will be continuing to fall into this place of just constant turmoil.
Thank you so much. Denisha,
I did want to say something. It was so great. Okaikor is so good at this. And she's been like really helping all of us, at least for me. Let me speak for myself. She's been helping me so much learn to like really live this way, because I get caught up in a sense of urgency. I get caught up in perfectionism. I get caught up in trying to move real fast and not think about everything. And so it's been really grounding to be like, we're not in a rush. We're going to wait. We're going to take our time. We're going to think this through, right? And how much that helps avoid the problems down the line, right? But I did want to speak to something you said about like the entanglements, right? I think some of this is really hard for people, right? Loving engagement and empathy are great. Diversity and globalism are great, right? Some people, even Black people, might get caught up on trans affirming and queer affirming, right? Like that's one that they struggle with. And then also all of this with really young children. And so I forgot to say, talking about teachers, right? What do? Teachers bring this work to young children, right? So this is a book called What We Believe, a Black Lives Matter Principles activity book. It was written by Lelania Garcia, who's a kindergarten teacher in New York City. And the artwork, and she does most of our artwork, she's like our resident artist, is Karen Davidson. And she's a high school art teacher in Queens. One of the first things Lelania did was take the 13 guiding principles and write them in language for young children. Like that's the work of teachers to make this accessible, right? And so recently, until this Lee and Low published it, they were just giving this out for free. We had PDFs on the website, download the coloring book. It's beautiful, right? There are coloring book pages and prompts and art for each principle. So how do we explain it to young children? So I think part of, like Chris said, it's like, it's not one lesson, it's just like how you approach all of this work in a way to make it make sense for your children, right? And a lot of ways students can do that is books, coloring, stories, right? And what's really special is that as the kids learn about the principles, they point them out down the line, down the year, right? They're quick to be like, oh, that story, they just needed to practice loving engagement. Or why weren't they trans affirming that student in their school, right? They understand and they use the language. So we see that happening. And that's really important too. And there was one other thing I wanted to, the principles, right? How we struggle with them. One of the teachers that I'm interviewing said, the Black woman, she really was uncomfortable around, trans affirming and queer affirming, but she made a commitment the past year to really do it, to just talk about it, say the words to her students and talk about it. And it got one student in her class to open up about having a brother who was gay. And he then went home and talked to his brother about the whole conversation. And the brother was like, what, y'all talk about this in your class? And then the brother came in and spoke to the class and talked about, his identity, and, he wears nails, and, the kids had all these questions about it. And that connection would have never been made for that student, for his brother, for that teacher, and for all those children if that teacher didn't just put aside that discomfort and say, I owe it to my babies to have this conversation, right? And so that's the power, I think, of this work, or how you get past these, oh, I don't know if I can do this. Oh, how is this going to turn out? You just trust in the children that they need this, right? And they're going to make sense of it. And even, if the parents are going to get mad about it later, right? It's not about them. It's about the children in your classroom and trying to honor them in ways that we have never done before.
Thank you so much. Chris, you want to add?
Oh, they said it all.
I know. No pressure. Well, that's okay. I'm going to move to the two questions that we have here, but I'm cognizant of time. We're about at 8:17, 8:18. I'm going to start with the first one here. I'm not an educator. I'm a fearless, unapologetic Black grandmother that attended segregated schools, was never taught anything about Black people until I went to college in 1975. My ethnic studies professor was white and looked nothing like me. What can I do to help?
Continue being a fearless, unapologetic grandmother. I mean, I think that's first, right? And I think if anything, what we're doing, I think one of the important interventions that we seek to make through Black Lives Matter at School is also opening up that sometimes the at school can get people, right? Where it's just like, this is not just about school, fam. Like, this is not just about what's happening in the school buildings, but where learning happens in so many places, in particular in Black communities. You think of like, places of faith, street corners, basketball courts, beauty salons, barbershops, outside the club on a Friday night, outside the bar, inside the bar. So there's so many spaces in which we convene and, come together to study, right? And in some way of like, just, how are we reflecting on our lived experiences, and how are we imagining our, possibilities of intervening, like not in, sometimes people get caught up in just like the macro scales of like, what needs to be happening on like state and national policy for the revolution. But the revolution is kind of really in those, micro moments, those small relationships, the conversation that you have with your grandchildren, or like those moments are the bedrock of building, a serious critical consciousness in this country. If we're going to get anywhere, it has to begin there. So I think, when I say like, that's where the moment begins, and I think that's important. And just from hearing how you worded your intro, I feel like I just want to validate that you might be doing that work already. So I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Okay, the second question, and bear with me, I'm not even going to try to paraphrase it. I'm just going to read it as is. I don't want to sound ignorant about this topic and what all it covers, because I'm not as educated as I should be on this. My only issue, question, thought: with this platform is that it makes America and the school system seem very black and white, when in reality, we have a beautiful array of colors. I agree. I agree. We should celebrate and love our Black students and families and coworkers and communities. But as a future teacher, I feel like if I am a white teacher saying Black Lives Matter, I think it would come across to my other students of differing backgrounds like they are left out. I don't know if that's a question, more posing a thought, and want to know what you all think about that. All right, now.
Do you want to go? Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. I'll say when I started, I was concerned about this. My last college I was at before I came to New York at Sarah Lawrence, I was teaching at Trinity Washington University in DC. It's a very small private Catholic college that is predominant, all female at the undergrad level. And now the demographics shifted, where in the 70s, it was all white women, now it's all predominantly Black and brown girls, first generation. We had an amazing funder that allowed us to bring in a lot of dreamers. So we had a lot of Latinx young girls there, and that was great. So I have this class, right? And to the other question, right? I teach this, and I have not come across a class that I've taught yet where I can't bring in, because anti-Blackness is everywhere. So there's no subject that I've taught, but this was a college writing class. And I was, I wanted them to do the prompt that we had for the student creative challenge that year. And it said, in a school where Black Lives Matter, ... And so I'm creating a document, and I keep saying, should I write Black/brown? Because all of them were Latinx, right? There was 1 or 2 Black students, 1 or 2 white students, but predominantly Latinx. And I went back and forth, and I was like, no, this is the prompt. I'm not changing it. I'm just going to give it to them. And I asked, they did it, and I asked them, is that uncomfortable for you as a non-Black student, person of color, to hear that? And they were like, no, we know what it means. No, we don't feel excluded. We get it. Black lives don't matter. They're like, we know that. We went to school here, right? So I think in a lot of ways, we think it's going to be excluding to the children, but they get it, right? And actually, this movement is very intersectional, right? We do look at the Black diaspora, right? We look at across, all types of cultures. We are very much not, if you start by uplifting Black people, right? Black trans people, right? Black queer people, right? You are going to catch everyone, right? We're not leaving anyone out of this movement, right? A lot of the curriculum work, we were looking at the connections between Black and Indigenous communities, right? And how that has not been explored in a lot of ways, right? So I think, it doesn't mean only Black Lives Matter. And I think that's what people are so afraid of when they hear those words, that you're saying only Black Lives Matter, or you're saying Black Lives Matter and no other lives matter. And that's not what it means. And the youth get that. They really do understand that in different ways, right? Sometimes they hear, so I had a high school teacher say, yeah, sometimes the kids will say, well, I think all lives matter, because they think it's being exclusionary. And so we talk about how when we say Black Lives Matter, we're not saying it's just Black lives. It's we're focusing on this group, and they tend to get it, but they get it very quickly. Younger children, I haven't heard of one that'll counter that, right? You say, oh, Black Lives Matter, and they go, oh yeah, right, of course, right? They don't really think outside of that. So I think it's more of an adult issue that we are having a hard time grappling with, this idea that we can be unapologetic, right? That's the other principle. I don't know if I mentioned it, one of our principles, unapologetically Black, like that grandmother, right? And so that's really important to think about. It's okay to be unapologetically Black and say Black Lives Matter. Doesn't mean that I'm not also looking out for, our Asian American brothers and sisters who are always been attacked, but are now being attacked, where people act like that hasn't happened before. It's happened a lot, right? It's just coming back now, right? Thinking about our Latinx family and how we can uplift them, and our Afro-Latina connections, right? I identify as Afro-Latina, right? So I think it's just something that you have to explore for yourself, but your students, if you explain it in a way, they get it, right? They typically really do get it. I don't know if Okaiko or Chris want to jump in.
I was just gonna say, I think the bottom line is that anti-Blackness, if we understand that race, this racial construct that we have is a clear hierarchy, right? And so and if you go to every single system, every single institution, that hierarchy, that coding, white on top, Black at the bottom, and every other group is trying to fight for position in between to get as far away from Blackness as possible and as close to whiteness as possible, right? And so this doesn't say that only Black Lives Matter, but what it says is that until Black people are free, no one else will be. Because currently, as it stands, as it is, Black people are not free. And everyone else too ain't free either, right? So the reason why our Asian brothers and sisters, our Latinx brothers and sisters, our Pacific Islander brothers and sisters are having the experience they're having is because of this hierarchy of race, of white supremacy, anti-Blackness. And so it appears that it's white and black and white, but really it's, it really is. I mean, if you can go to every single community and how anti-Blackness plays out, but then every single institution and how it's coded, everything was in our education system, white on top, Black on the bottom. Healthcare, white on top, Black at the bottom. Housing, white on top. Wealth gap. I mean, you can go to every single system. What we need is everyone to be free, because no one is free, right? Even for some of the white folks, poor white people who are struggling, but don't even realize that they're struggling so much is because of anti-Blackness, right? And it doesn't ignore that. We know that there are Black Asian folks. We know that there are Black Latinx folks. We know that there are Black Indigenous folks too, because we also know that it's playing out in all of these communities, and right. So we need to also bring all of that into this space, right, so that we can all become free, right? Because we're not. Chris.
Yeah, and I mean, one, if I was teaching, I think I put into the chat, right? Hope everyone's seen Judas and the Black Messiah, even if you're just like, you don't agree with it, but want to talk about it. I think it's important because Fred Hampton and the work of the Rainbow Coalition that is portrayed within that movie, I think is a perfect extension to the question that you're asking. But also I'll add that I think one of the things that I see in that framing of the question is sometimes we start to think that there's race and then there's racism, when it's really the inverse. Racism created race. And Cedric Robinson sort of talks about the work of the Black radical tradition. With the work of Black resistance is trying to overthrow the entire race-based structure of the world. So it's, in many ways, in thinking of this like relationship to like Black organizing and resistance to other communities, is thinking of how these categories, right? These categories that were created through these, through colonial violence, and sort of held up by these cultural, strategies, are meant to divide us, right? And sort of like isolate us and seclude us from other ways of relating to one another, other ways of caring about one another. And what Blackness shows us, right? And I don't know how deep you want to get into it, because even, the idea of the transatlantic slave trade, you have people coming from a lot of different communities all across Africa onto one boat. They don't speak the same language among one another, but when they realize together, right, they create this idea that we are all Black, we are all part of this one thing, and we are united, right? And we create within that a people that knows what we're against, right? We know we're against this this form of violence. So I just want to, I don't think there's a way to answer that question for you, but I think like extending it with these moments of history in the way that you can kind of continue to sit with that, I think it's important for just our continued development. So it's 8:29, I'm gonna shut up. Thank you.
Well, this is the most painful part of an amazing webinar, when you have to wrap everything up. We are blessed to have you all as panelists tonight, and I'm going to speak for everyone out there in virtual land that your insight and your compassion and just your energy certainly has been restorative for me. And it's just at that time in the semester and just in life where spring is supposed to be about new beginnings, but you have all of this stuff weighing down on you. And so this, to me, this webinar is right on time in terms of re-gearing and getting ready for the summer and doing the work that must be done, because there's no season of recess or relaxation. We have to do the work and rest in between. So I want to remind everybody that there is a survey. I think when you leave the session that you will be prompted to complete that survey. And we also have the post-webinar discussion at 3 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. So please join us for that. I've taken some notes, and there's certainly lots of resources that we have shared with you tonight in the chat. So you have time between now and 3 p.m. to read something and think about something before then. So thank you so much. I'm